All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. We have got a very big show for you today. We are responding to the very thing that you've been asking for, folks. We are having behind the scenes conversations with real decisions that real people are making, Ben, and then we're making them transparent so people can hopefully learn from them today. What else are we covering?
Well, Bryce, in what's making property news, I'm on my soapbox talking politics or dumb things, dumb decision politicians are making. It's election time in New South Wales and then Queensland. What are they thinking? Too much
What
sun. Too
are they
much sun up in
thinking?
Queensland. Stupid decisions being made. More about that later in the show.
Stick around, folks, see what those stupid decisions are and plenty more. Let's rip into the show.
Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. And Ben, I'm not sure if I'm interested in how your week's been because I think I know where this is going to go.
Well, it started off pretty well on Friday night, particularly Bryce, with obviously the boys getting the job done, kicking the last 8 of the game.
I was there. Got the kids home at 2 o'clock. So not only did I have to deal with Jack, not happy about Geelong losing, but
how did the Purple Haze go?
So I'm glad you asked because I don't think I'm ever going to speak about Fremantle ever again because I am so internally frustrated. Did you watch it? I mean, your wife follows Fremantle. Did you catch any of it?
We caught about 3 minutes of it at the end. She's actually, she's tuned off. I've got Jack and Jane who aren't big footy followers. Harry and I tend to be the sporty followers in the household. So I didn't see. It did look like a bit of a dire.
You didn't miss anything, mate. I'll summarise it for you. We kicked it sideways. We kicked it sideways. We kicked it sideways. We kicked it sideways. We did nothing to do anything that would suggest that we were attacking the ball. And no disrespect to St Kilda, but they were down some of their best players. And across every single line, we are on paper significantly better. So I thought about this because when I talk to you about heckling you any way I can about Collingwood, I always go, oh, how many grand finals has Collingwood lost? And you go, yeah, no worries. But at least I go to the footy nearly every week and I'm happy. And I thought about that comment on the weekend. I'm thinking, actually, isn't that interesting? Because I tend to go to the footy tune in to the Purple Haze and end up not happy, right? So just that's the summary. Not happy. And let's just hope it's a round one glitch, but it just felt like 29 years of deja vu, Ben. Anyway, should we move on?
Hang fat, but if you do want to move, there is a team, a little black and white team that, needs it. As always,
mate. This is what I would do. I'd order him in alphabetical order and I'd take Collingwood out just so that there was no risk that when I threw a dart at it that I ended up with Collingwood. That's what I would do. But yeah, you've got your Collingwood swagger, so people can't see that. I can see it, but
it's only round one. Early, mate. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint.
Let's move on, folks. Today, Ben and I have put together an episode that we think should be able to help a lot of people because here's the feedback that we get when we're talking to our listener base that we put out a survey previously when we get to hear what the questions that roll in. It's a lot of people want to know what are some of the scenarios that you're facing. And I guess it's easy for you and I, Ben, if we don't stop and pause and reflect, to think, it's pretty easy for us to go, okay, we're having scores and scores and scores of conversations over a week, over a fortnight, over a month with incredible, we're proud of our team, so incredible A-grade professionals who are at the top of their game. And so they're going, this scenario came up and this is how we dealt with it. And this lending scenario came up and this is how we dealt with it. And this planning scenario came up and this is how we dealt with it. So you and I thought, well, why don't we actually share some of the behind the scenes of some of the conversations we're having, some of the conversations that our team is having, with the intention to go, here's what's actually happening behind the veil, and here's a couple of takeaways that you've got from it so that hopefully you can apply it, or at the very least just go, ooh, start the cogs ticking over, Ben, around some of the stuff that's going on in our industry, because you and I hate one thing more than anything, and that is the one size fits all approach that often happens in our industry. They are tailored, unique, individual circumstances that we're being exposed to, and we figured it might be a good opportunity today. So we're gonna cover that. I know you've got some points you want to add, but before we get there, I'm just going to do my mindset minute, Ben. So the mindset minute theme today is one of my favorites, Alex Hormozy, and he said this comment here. It's easy to feel motivated and energized when starting something new and to feel a sense of accomplishment when you reach the finish line. Okay, nothing too insightful there, but here's the important part. However, the middle part of the process, which is often the longest and most challenging, is where the real work and progress happen. Double click, bold, underline, italic, reread, is where the real work and progress happen. So it's where you face obstacles, setbacks, self-doubt, and where you have to find the internal motivation to drive to keep going. So why did I bring this up, Ben? Because I think it's really important right now, because for anyone who's been building their portfolio over the last decade, you might be in the messy middle right now. For anyone who's been doing it for 20 and 30 years like us, Ben, maybe not. But for those of you that have been just starting, and you may have been investing for 4 years, you may have been investing for 7 years, you may have been investing for 2 years, you might have just bought your first investment property, and now you're facing headwinds that we're experiencing right now. Interest rates, cost of living, banks, headlines. You will quite possibly be finding yourself in the messy middle right now. So here's the jam, right? If you can master this middle part of the process, and the way you do that is you stay focused, you stay disciplined, and you make sure you have the suitable motivation, well, then the beginning and the end just take care of themselves, right? So if you can push past this, and you find yourself in the messy middle, this is what you're going to do. Stay the course. Be disciplined. Stick to your habits. Trim where necessary, and the end will take care of itself. And Ben, I did borrow this line from you. It may sound corny, so I just want to check the corny test, but
Sure.
your future self will thank you for it. So you've been saying that for a long time, but it's when you're in the messy middle that when what you've been saying is actually where the rubber meets the road. Because if you don't get through the messy middle, you don't get to actually have that conversation with your present self, which is currently your future self, looking back going, wow, geez, I made some good decisions back then, and I pushed through the hard times.
And some hard times are unavoidable. Obviously black swan events or circumstances that you haven't planned for. This is where you do need to have that resolve, and you do need to find a way, to Bryce's point, and stay the course. What we're seeing anecdotally, and what we're hearing, and it's a classic case of that sheep behavior, where people are now starting to make irrational decisions, emotional decisions. They're not doing the work, and they're potentially going to be sacrificing or selling things that, in 3 or 4 years' time, when things are far better than they are now, would be going, oh, I wish I didn't have to do that. Well, in theory, you probably didn't have to do that in the first instance if you had have actually then come and got some advice, and seen how we can do that. And we've got a couple of great examples in that today. But the other point I want to make here, Bryce, is that the messy middle doesn't have to be that messy if you did have a plan and you had contingencies. In other words, if your contingency was that interest rates weren't going to stay super low at emergency levels forever, and you factored in long-term interest rates, even in at 4.5% to 5.5% for the next 3 years, but longer-term interest rates, which we've been telling our clients forever since we started doing planning work, and we're talking about 6.5 to 7.25 is our long-term interest rate bandwidth. That gives you an idea that those people would be sitting back going, actually, we're pretty good. We're okay. We don't have as much of that messy middle. But it is when life gets in the way that it's often challenging. Because in our book, The Armchair Guide to Property Investing, we do talk about it's set and forget. In most cases, it's like, 10 hours a year, you can actually run a property portfolio. Like, it doesn't take that much once you have everything set up. But it's the messiness and the challenge and the struggle is around the lifestyle design and how you're putting those pieces together, and not thinking about those future pacing that you needed to think about when you put that design together. And that's when you want to use a sounding board and someone to bounce that off. That's not a family member. That's not someone who you want to copycat, because that is the piece that, oh, well, they've done it. John and Mary have done it, so we'll just follow them. Well, their life journey is completely different, and it's a tailored solution. So I think there's a lot of good messages in what Alex is saying, but I'm also putting a caveat on that to sort of say, if you plan for some of that contingency, then you probably wouldn't be as panicked in this moment in time.
100%, because if you go to the last part of the quote, Ben, it's where you face obstacles, setbacks, and self-doubt, and where you have to find the internal motivation and drive to keep going. So that's what the messy middle is defined by, is by having to find that internal drive based on the fact that you are having some fears, you are having some self-doubt, you are seeing some external stuff. So to your point, you don't need to find internal motivation and drive. If you've actually got a compass and you've got a plan and you've got a roadmap and you're on track and you've got markers along the way to make sure that you know what you're doing. So I guess that's why we want to talk to what we're talking to today, because we can show people who are actually doing that, taking away some of that anxiety. But there's some people here who just in whatever stage that they're doing in their portfolio, or they might not know what's around the corner, or they might not know how to do that cash flow modeling, Ben. So that's important that we understand that if you're feeling that way, you're not alone. And it's actually this is the stuff that defines you, because if you get through it, you then actually have the benefit of being the person that actually looks in the rear vision mirror and goes, that's what I did, rather than looking in the rear vision mirror going, oh, that's what I could have done. So that's really important. All right, let's kick on with today. So what we did is we reached out to our planning team. Special thanks to Andy Trigg, who helped us with some scenarios today of what he is experiencing at the coalface. And the first one, Ben, is interesting, right? Because it is a common scenario, and it's why we've kicked off with this one, that we see happening a lot of times. And that's where people, they decide to make decisions without actually having line of sight on the unintended consequences of those decisions. So let's give a little backstory onto this particular client's circumstances. We're not going to talk about names here, keep that totally anonymous. We're just going to talk about circumstances. But this is the first one. With a client that had they bought an investment property for $1 million, Ben. And here's the important part: without a strategy, without a line of sight on what that actually meant. So now they wanted to engage in a conversation with us around their cash flows, because they were at a high risk of having to sell the property that they just bought due to interest rates. Okay, no major headline there. I think a few people are faced right now with not sort of planning for huge interest rate movements. But here's the bit that they had to start thinking about, Ben, which is the unfortunate part for lifestyle design, which is the unfortunate part about having these little big rocks and these milestones along the way. Here's what they had to model as a result of that decision. Selling cars, shortening maternity leave to return back to work full time, removing a wedding, and removing renovations. Now, anyone who's listening to that going, whoa, that's the point of life. Renovating and getting married and driving my car and taking extra time on mat leave when we have that wonderful ball of joy in our hands. So this is a very good example of what happens when you execute without thinking around the corner, right? So if they had if anyone can relate to that or knows someone or is thinking about that, here's the unintended consequence. If we had actually had conversations prior, we would have been able to talk about, okay, based on all of those things that you want to do, and they're all perfectly fine in a lot of cases, here's what the decision is that you need to make now. Here's the price point. Here's the expected historical growth. But importantly, here's the yield we're chasing. Because if you get that yield, then we don't have to compromise on cash flow on all these other scenarios. So super important, Ben, that we actually have a strategy first.
So what I love about this particular story is, well, there's so many good takeaways. The first one I want to focus in on is Bryce and Ben just say maximize the purchase price. So just go for the highest purchase price as you possibly can, and you're not going to make a mistake. right? So now this couple went, okay, well, is that what they say? Is that really what we say? Well, no, not really. But that takeaway could have been that. And so that has got them into a lot of trouble. Now, we often see the story the other way around where it's like, we didn't get any advice either, and we didn't do any cash flow modeling. So we bought a $400,000 property instead of a $650,000 property because our cash flows could have accommodated that. So in both cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars of future wealth is at risk based on this fail to plan. Now, again, there's a couple of big lessons there. That's the first takeaway for me. The second big lesson for me is they were honest enough to basically come back and say, we've made a mistake, right? So we probably didn't understand everything you're talking about in terms of the importance of future pacing those cash flows and getting some reliability around that, because now we find ourselves in a situation where we are going to have to work out whether we can reduce some of our lifestyle spending to try and manage through this difficult period over the next 3 to 5 years. And to their credit, again, they're going to hold tough. And ultimately, that is going to bode well for their future wealth position. And ultimately, that's a good story, because what a lot of people in this situation would be doing, Bryce, is they're probably tapping out and they're probably saying to themselves, I can hear their narrative now. Oh, yeah, this property thing wasn't for us. We tried it, so we bought something about 18 months ago
Yes.
and then interest rates went up. And yeah, so not everyone makes money out of property. And so we're just going to move on and have a look at some other things. But that's because whereas the narrative should have been, well, if we're truly honest with ourselves and we gave ourselves the mirror test, we would have actually saying, we're in this position from the decisions that we made and the trade-offs that we did at that time. And what did we learn about that? Well, we learned that we probably don't know what we think we know. And it's probably best that next time we embark on a journey like this, we get some help or we do some further planning, some further rigor and testing and scenarios in terms of, the sort of challenges that we might face, because where we might end up might be in a greater position in terms of the overall wealth position that we're going to build out. So some really good lessons for me in terms of this first case study that Andy has put in front of us for us to review.
Yeah, so here's the other part of the story. Imagine if we could say he'd been on, it was a rubbish property, and so that's just really compounded how bad it was, and they should have got. Well, no, we actually had a look at the property, and it is actually investment grade. So it's possible to get an investment grade asset, but here's something that I think is investment grade, Ben. It has owner occupier appeal, it has scarcity, and investment grade is the three things, right? But part of investment grade is actually buying within your means to have cash flow, right? Because arguably, some of the most expensive real estate in the country has got really great returns, but it's not investment grade because for the yield is so rubbish that it's just not achievable for people to actually settle on the property and hold it longer term. So part of investment grade is actually knowing that it's actually cash flow sufficient for your circumstances to be able to hold it. So one person might be able to invest in a $1.5 million property, and another person might not. So therefore, it's not investment grade to the person who can't hold it because it's going to cripple them and snow them under. In this case, to one person, the same $1 million property could be investment grade, but this one here. So I should qualify that in terms of investment grade. Had owner occupier appeal, it's got the scarcity for the asset, but for it to fully qualify as being investment grade, we need to be considering the cash flow around it as well. So important. I wonder if there's many people who can listen to this story going, ooh, yeah, I can actually relate to that. I made a decision before I thought about some of the other, we always talk about putting the big rocks in the jar, Ben, but what about the medium rocks in the jar? And
It's all about optimizing for your situation. So in this particular case, they optimized too high, they went too aggressive, and there's been consequences. If you optimize too low, same thing. You're just robbing yourself of future wealth. So there is a preferred pathway that people should be looking to go on, and if you pace yourself and you plan for that, you have less of these challenging moments in life.
Very good. So that was scenario one. Scenario two, Ben, is another common one that comes up in the conversation with our team, right? So Andy said this. It's a young couple. So it's really the decision around, do I buy my first home or do I buy an investment property first? Okay, so young couple in Sydney wanting to get into the property market, and they were tossing up between buying that decision we just described. So here's the part of the conversation that's often missed is sometimes this becomes a conversation around lending first, right? What are the lending options we've got? Because being able to provide the deposits and some of the incentives that are on offer help people get onto the ladder for some, and for others it's not quite necessary. So they wanted to know what low deposit schemes were actually available to them. They also had to factor in that they were temporarily relocating to New Zealand for work at different times. So their cash flow had to factor in living costs in two countries, so Oz and New Zealand, and they needed to make sure that their cash flow was able to support that, right? So the cash buffer was really important because couple of big rocks, but also a couple of smaller, more medium-sized rocks were coming. Plus, they have weddings coming up, new cars, all the future plans that they want when they come back to Australia. So, before we get to the conclusion here, Ben, it's worth putting some commentary around this because a lot of people are faced with this situation. Which one should I do first?
Yeah, and again, you've got to think about the location that they're in. This is a clear example of property ladder. Which way do I go? Realizing the best return. And from a rent investing point of view, most of the time, the idea of rent investing is to live where I want to live. And that might be share house type arrangement, which gives me the lifestyle benefits that I want for the age that I am. But as long as I'm trapping that other surplus and making that money work for me, and I'm holding some property assets, that's the magic of the rent vesting model, which we're looking at here potentially for this, as opposed to, as I said, the first step on the property ladder. And this is a good example where in Sydney, where you've got the choice of the annual land tax versus paying the stamp duty, would mean that you got less of a deposit buffer to carry, so you don't have to save as much. So that would have to come into the considerations. But two, it's another great example of if I'm moving around and living and working remotely, what are the pros and cons of that? So we have a lot of people who are fly in, fly out around the country, and they're making good incomes. And so what can we do around that? Like, do we just get a static investment property, or if we are both moving to New Zealand for a period of time, is it best to then rent out the property that's our principal place of residence? And so there's a really good mix of concepts here that you would then start to work through to finally settle on the best solution for this particular couple.
Now, rent vesting, folks, is something that you've got to really stay committed to as well, because once you go down that path, if you want to do a U-turn, it's difficult because you've actually made a strategic decision not to put lots of resources into a resource-rich decision that comes from being able to buy a principal place of residence, because you often want it to be usually a little higher at times, plus you're the only one paying it off. And so doing a deviation from the plan is difficult. So once you're rent vesting, you've got to commit to it. But in this situation, Ben, and before I give the solution that was coming up, I want to put in a little disclaimer that please do not rinse and repeat on this in your circumstances without pressure testing it against your circumstances. But in this case, the recommendation from Andy was that the client was better to purchase their first property, the first property as a personal home, given that the concessions were available and they were limited by a cash deposit. So in their circumstances, that is what ended up being the best scenario for them. So that's important, Ben, because there's no one size fits all here.
No, getting in, like this is a scenario of, okay, well, if we wanted to buy an investment property and we're going to have a higher loan to value ratio, there's going to be a large LMI cost, the interest rates are going to be higher, the concessions were enough. And these guys were smart enough to sort of say, well, here's how it would have rolled out, right? So you've got effectively you probably pay the land tax, given that it's only the first ladder on the property journey. So that's number one. In addition to that, when you were moving to New Zealand for a period of time, you've also got to say, well, with your principal place of residence, you also get the ability to rent out that property, and any capital gain that you have in that first 6 years is capital gains tax free. So all of a sudden it started to make a lot more sense to be able to pull all that together. So now that might be different in Victoria or different in other states in terms of what were the concessions available. They don't, New South Wales is the only state or territory that has this choice policy that they call it. So again, it's a case by case example. If you wanted to rinse and repeat this idea in Melbourne or Victoria, it may be completely different for you, and that's why. And if you're not going to be working remotely in New Zealand, which is a forced move out of that particular property, and if rents are really cheap and where you want to live, that could sway your decision into going down the rent vesting pathway. All of those are moulded based on the cash flow story we see and based on the lifestyle priorities that get presented to us. And Andy's done a great job in making a clear recommendation. Yeah, we're a property investment advisory firm, during the day, and here we are recommending buying a family home. That's a perfect example.
Real decisions for real people that have got real scenarios that they're facing. So that's the second scenario. The third scenario is a case of sell or hold. And that comes up a fair bit, right? And when you see the details of this scenario, it'll kind of make sense. But it was just under a decade the time horizon for this scenario to play out, which is an important time frame. So let's have a look. The client's goal was to secure the forever home for as much as possible in 2032. So as we record, just under a decade from now. They currently hold a one-bedroom unit that is an investment property now, but was previously the place that they lived in DY, which has got a value of $700,000. So what we were tested to do is to compare holding on to the existing property and selling it in 10 years to secure the forever home. So the DY property, keep it and sell it later. Or do we sell it now? Do we sell DY now and we buy a house that was standalone for $750,000 so that we could chase the superior growth that happens over the journey, typically if you get it right, because of the large land component. So the question that was posed is, all right, which one is going to perform better over such a short period of time? So there's a few things that we want to talk to here, but I guess the first one is typically a one-bedroom unit. Sydney's probably the most forgiving in the country for one-bedroom units, but when faced with the choice of the one-bedroom unit or a house, probably at face value to go to the house. But it's important to realise this is in walking distance to the beach and cafes of the northern beaches of Sydney. That is significant information. So if you're trying to overlay this and you're in some other part of the country or some other part of New South Wales, that's an important point, Ben.
You might be listening to this going, one bedroom, $700,000 in
Yes.
the normal suburban suburb of the northern beach. So that just gives you context of obviously property prices in that particular market. Now, there's a couple of things that you want to be looking at here to Bryce's point. The first one is you're talking about replacement value and changeover costs. So it's going to be quite expensive to be able to do those changeover costs. So you don't get any stamp duty concessions when you're potentially buying another investment property. And what I think Andy and the team would have had to look at here was the borrowing capacity. So because they already controlled the $700,000 property, but obviously with interest rates where they are, that's really reduced their borrowing capacity. The 750 value, the differentiation is not a lot. So if you are going to try and do this to then grow to a bigger owner-occupied purchase down the track in the big rock in the jar, you'd want that differentiation to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, because when you did the two scenario models, you could clearly see that even if you had approximate capital growth performance rates, that there would be a marked difference in terms of holding that property over the next 9 years or whatever. But it's because the recycle costs and the replacement cost value wasn't material enough, you can start to see that it's going to be a challenging outcome for anyone to sort of justify engaging in this idea of recycling the current investment property as part of that. But the story gets a little bit more.
Yeah, wait, there's more. There's more, Ben. So, okay, so the plot thickens here, right? So there was also a consideration that there was some significant structural repairs required. So a special levy needed to be raised, Ben. That's enough to make anyone go wonky at the knees, right? So Here's what happens. The clients have become emotionally turned off the property due to these repairs and wanted to sell. So, but here's the important point: they sought professional advice so that they could have an independent assessment of the asset for their personal circumstances, right? So here's one of the great things about being part of a collective that we get a little brains trust is what Andy did is he goes, all right, team, brought it open to the whole team. Let's thrash this out. What do you think? What do you think? What would you do? What would you do? So there was all the collective minds that went into that, which included reviewing the research around, using our resources that we've got for the research so that we could actually have access to everyone. And so you pitch for what you would do in this scenario and then ultimately come up with a conclusion. That is a multiplication event that is hard to replicate, hard to beat.
Yeah, it's an iron sharpens iron story where our team meet every week, and there's usually a scenario model. We're doing obviously tens, hundreds of plans a year, right? So we've got that brains trust. We've done over 3,000 of these plans. So you're putting all of that information together, and then you're ultimately, synthesizing that down also to the unique circumstances. So the critical things you'd want to know is how many people are putting towards that levy, what is the structural risk of that particular property, and then you're starting to think about all of those recycle costs in terms of bird in the hand versus the opportunity of what you're going to replace it with. So it really is quite an interesting story here, and when you deal with true professional advisors, they should be more cautious than like if you're dealing with someone who's trying to sell you something, then there's every chance that the advice that they're giving has a flavour to it that you might think you want to hear. But here we have a client, or clients, I should say, who are like, where we really want to sell this property because of X, Y, Z, but you've got an advisory team who's getting paid for advice. There's no financial gain at all other than the time of them to make that assessment, right? So what we then found out in this instance is the clients receive that collective advice of the entire property planning team, and that advice was to keep the existing one-bedroom apartment in DY, given its locality, given its desire, given its rentability. Yes, even though we do know that there's going to be some levies, the levies weren't significant enough to sort of push us off course. And then the unknown element of alternative returns when we had such an A-grade asset, even though the building needed some repair work, well, you can continue to keep doing those repair work over time. So that's the ultimate judgment call that was made by the collective group. And so even though the customer was sort of wanting validation to sell, ultimately in this particular case, the decision was to hold for now.
Location does 80% of the heavy lifting. We haven't rattled that off for a little while, Ben, but because it's not a theoretical scenario of going, do I sell that and buy a $750,000 house in DY? Not possible. Not possible. So you can't get pound for pound on the location, right? So therefore, the decision on whether we needed to relocate somewhere else or stay where we are. Now, if you're having this conversation, you're buying a one-bedroom apartment in Scarborough, in Perth, which has the same, probably a different conversation, right? But we're talking about Sydney. Sydney's apartment market operates so much more differently. So much more differently, is that all right? So much differently to the rest of the country. So that comes into the discussion point as well. Big population, all geographically gridlocked, trying to get into those northern beaches, always lots of demand. So therefore, that was the consensus, and that would have been very helpful for the client to get that understanding, looking at the cash flow, seeing what that would look like. Okay, let's proceed as planned, because the goal, clearly the big rock, was that forever home in 2032. They didn't work this out in real time, Ben, with real life lessons. They worked it out by having to think about it on paper first, trading that decision on paper first, and then in this case with a lot of collective minds that allowed them to go, okay, the consensus is this, let's proceed.
It took the emotion out of the decision, Bryce. Very, very powerful to do. So that in itself is worth the investment. Because when you've either got sunk cost bias or you've got emotional attachment or detachment from the property, those things do play with your biases, and ultimately you can potentially make decisions that may not necessarily be in your best interest in the medium to longer term. So, that one will play itself out. It was a conservative play, but hopefully it's the right play for that particular couple, and they get to execute on that. Obviously, they're living somewhere else because it's investment property, so they'll be saving away very hard in terms of building up their deposit as well. And hopefully that plays out, that they get that really wonderful dream home in 9 years from now.
Very good. All right, the last one we're going to cover today, scenario 4, is around a debt burden, Ben. This is a really interesting story, and I love it because it speaks to the fact that people are at different places at different parts of their journey. It's not all about just being able to take action on investing right now. So this particular client had multiple credit card debt, car loans, and importantly, mindset stuff here, always thought property was not achievable for people like her. Wow. Okay, so there's some conditioning that I'm stoked when you hear the story here. So the podcast motivated her that it is possible for everyone, but doesn't know really how to start digging herself out of the current bad debt hole to be able to build up a position that will be possible to buy a property. All right, how many people can relate to that? Right, thinking that it's not achievable for them. Okay, so that's important paradigm shifting here. So here was the plan, Ben. So there's a bit of detail here, then we'll talk to it, right? The plan was to be able to give some, really clear steps and timeframes to improve the situation one step at a time until being able to buy the first property. All right. So putting the pebbles in the creek so that we know which step to take next so that we actually get to the other side. Really beautiful stuff. So there was a personal loan of 11K that was used to pay off some credit card debt and then keep them, with a car loan for a four-wheel drive at $22,000, 3 credit cards totaling $15,000, and 2 cars on a $60,000 income.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So there's a bit of bad debt going on there. But over the next couple of years, becoming really motivated with her finances, was able to focus on a career and get a promotion to $80,000. Bang, 33% increase, Ben, on income. So that makes a significant difference, right, from 60 to 80. So before having a conversation with us, there was no strategy for paying down any of the debt, and just really moved on from one credit card to the next each month, using whichever had money on it. Right? And again, there'll be some people hearing that going, "Yep, I can relate to that." So making minimum repayments and 2 to 3 repayments behind on the personal loan. Always believed that this is how people like her lived, and property was for the rich. Right? Okay, so we've set the scene here. So here's the long-term strategy, right? And understanding we'll not be jumping into property until the house was in order. That's important. Foundations are right. So there was a focus on tracking every dollar spent for a few months to understand where the money is going. Then setting up money smarts with clear spending limits. Sold 1 car as 2 was just a luxury. Used those funds to knock out 2 credit cards and close them. Then focused on all surplus on remaining credit card before moving on to the personal loan. That's expensive debt, credit card debt. So that's wise doing that. And plus, when you're doing credit cards, we debate this, Ben, the debt avalanche, the debt snowball. For people that are in debt challenges, they got into that in the first place. So you got to game that to get them out. And so having these small wins along the way are very, very important. So stayed committed to the plan for the next 18 months, was able to remove all debt and purchase the first investment property. Purchased the first investment property 2 years after that first meeting. So it now has a new view on spending and wealth and realises the future's in her hands. Ben, how in awe of that story do you need to be?
This is why we do what we do. This is the classic transformational story. The conditioning, as you mentioned earlier, this is my plot in life. I can't break the mold. All the people that I mix and mingle with are similar to me and relatable in terms of that. Well, she took it upon herself to move out of that mindset and get to work. And she did need someone holding her hand. In this case, Andy did a brilliant job in sort of holding her hand, showing the pathway, making the invisible visible, reducing the cognitive load in terms of saying, see, all of the numbers are done. Now you've got money smarts ready to roll. This is the annual surplus that you're going to be able to trap. That surplus is now, once we become debt free, everything then focuses in on that IP, that investment property. And here we are, two and a bit years later after that initial plan. And there's a material change, but there's also a mindset of abundance and optimism as opposed to a mindset of struggle and battle. And that for this person is her story. And I'm hoping she's telling others about that particular story, because it is possible, people. This is not made up. This is real people making real change, and getting ahead in life. And it's the reason we do what we do, Bryce.
Isn't it the story of the three little pigs here, Ben? Isn't it? I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down when it's on the foundation of sand. And what's the other one? I'm a bit scratchy. Straw. But then when they put it on a foundation of stone, then you can face that. So what was important here was making sure that the foundation wasn't set on sand and straw. It was set on stone. So that's the reinforcing point and the takeaway point here. And again, part of the conversation we have, and you mentioned, Annie, thanks to Davey Robertson too, for this one here as part of our planning team. But it is a compelling story, and there's a lot of joy that comes out of that. Probably, if I'm honest, more joy than the wealth creation part, because it's the paradigm shift that you make here for someone to go, oh, I didn't think, the amount of time someone says, and we've had someone on our summer series last season go, I just thought that was for the rich people. But when you get the people who can actually change their circumstances, and anyone can make a difference in their life, Ben, if they actually just learn how to spend less than they earn, trap surplus, and then put that to work. For us, it's obviously property, but there's a whole range of options that you can do, even just small little investments into ETFs or, whatever it is that you want to do. But it's just that discipline and that habit. And James Clear says, don't set goals for the end outcome, set goals for the habits. All right. And if you set for the habits here, so if we go back to that state, committed to the plan, was able to remove all the debt and purchase the investment property within 2 years, that's setting the habits as the goal, and therefore the rest takes care of itself, which really talks to our mindset minute at the top.
Super bright future ahead, Bryce. That's all I can say. It's like, overcome the challenges, change the habits and behaviours, and now has built new challenges, new milestones, and has a plan to become what she plans to become.
Very good. I like it. So there you go. So 4 models, 4 scenarios there. Hopefully they have given you a little bit of insight into lifting the veil and seeing what's going on behind the scenes. We're going to do more of that going forward, to just try and, again, show you some of the machinations and the thinking and the brain trust that's going on with our team, so that you can be the benefit and you can maybe apply some of that to some of the decisions that you're currently facing yourself. So very good. Thank you to Andy and Dave for their help for that as well. Hey, my life hack today, Ben, is something that I've implemented, and maybe you might want to do this as well. And I can only talk to the Apple Podcast app. So again, I'm not being agnostic here. But I've recently gone and created playlists on my podcasts. So do you know how you've got a whole ream of podcasts and you've always got your favorite 2 or 3 that you always listen to? But there's certain scenarios that you can do. So like you create on Spotify, you create a playlist for the songs you want to hear. You can create a playlist on the Apple podcast app as well. So what you do is you tap on, once you're in the podcast, you tap on the library. So I'll get you to do this, Ben, so that we can actually walk through it. Have you got your phone there?
Got my phone here, mate. Let's go for it.
So open the Apple Podcast app.
Yep, I'm on the library. Yep.
Down the bottom 4, you've got 4 choices. There's one that says library. Tap on that.
At the top, at the top or the bottom?
Oh, no, down the bottom, you've got listen now, browse, library, and search. Can you see that once you've opened the app?
No.
It's going beautifully. It's going beautifully.
What about the 3 dots? No.
Yeah, so when you open the app, and what have you got down the very bottom? No. Go back down to the very bottom. So it's
Nothing.
got library down the bottom, right down the bottom. No, not down, just down the bottom at the thing right there.
Yeah, I'm on library. I tick that. Yep.
Beautiful. That's all. That's where we're at. And then at the top, go to the top the three little dots at the top,
Oh, yep, got it.
and then it says new station.
Ah, yeah.
Create new station, and then title it. Now I'll give you a couple of things. I've got money and finance. I've got property. I've got long drives. I've got business growth. So all of the ones that I put into stations, right? Because when I go for a long drive with caravan behind Ben, I just go straight to my station. And then I go, well, these are the ones I listen to on a long drive. Or here's the ones I listen to. And it just automatically gives me the most recent 2 episodes. Or in fact, I can go and say, give me the most recent one only. I can put the last 10. There's a whole range of things. So I just found that and I thought, oh, that's pretty good. I know that was a bit clunky. So the listeners are going, geez, if Ben can't do it, but how can I do it?
Well, no,
but
I
trust
was
me.
already in library, so that was my bad.
That's right. So there you go. So what you do is you go to library, you tap the 3 dots at the top right-hand corner, you tap new station, then add a title, and then you just add the podcast that you want to be in that station. And so to adjust the number of episodes from each podcast that you've added to your station, just tap the station you want to change, tap station settings, then tap episodes. So that's my life hack today, Ben.
Nice
And
one,
I'm
Bryce.
sure you can do that on all the Android apps as well. You know you can make playlists on Spotify, but it was just one of those ones that I've come across and it's been super helpful for me. Maybe it could be super helpful for you. So there you go.
Sounds good.
What's making property news, Ben?
Well, big week, Bryce. We've got a few things coming up. Obviously, there's decision time in New South Wales. It's the election this Saturday. So I thought it would be important to talk about some of the ideas that are coming out of that particular state around the property market, right? So there was a big announcement on the Kids Future Fund. So I want to talk to that in a minute. But the other one I wanted to talk about was quickly the new stamp duty reform changes, right? So what you're able to do is if you took the choice of the land tax, you are now able to continue that choice as you move up the property ladder.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that if you, again, it's quite smart. So in other words, I go, as first home buyer, I get that choice. Now, if I take that choice straight up, then I get to move into my second property and I get to take that choice again. If I went stamp duty up front, I know I don't get that choice on the second property. But then when you get to finally that dream home, the home for the future, you also have the choice to pay a one-off stamp duty cost. So I just think that that's good in terms of encouraging mobility and movement of houses so people can get the right home that they're looking for without paying these big, hefty stamp duty costs. So that's the one thing. Now, I do want to talk about...
Sorry, Ben, just to that point, it actually does away with just lip service around how can we fix land tax. It's actually a meaningful plan for people to actually go, well, I want to stop having an annuity payment once I get to my dream home, my forever home.
Yeah. So
in the meantime, I'll save on stamp duty so I can keep moving. And as you say, creating mobility and creating more stock, and because supply we know is part of it. So that's
now,
good.
at the end of the day, we want our politicians to have great ideas. We want at the end of the day, debate those ideas, but settle on some good ideas rather than settle on the politics. So a second point to that is the Kids Future Fund. Again, a really smart idea in terms of what the government's proposing is they'll go in dollar for dollar to allow you to build up a nest egg that come when you're 18, you can put that money into and to paying off for your education, your future HECS debt. Because remember, those in our younger generations, they are challenged by if they go to university, they're going to have a HECS debt, then they've got to save for a home. It's not easy. So being able to take some of the government money and have this forced savings, because that's what it would be, mechanism, could allow them to have a material amount of money that will allow them to continue to keep growing that, to choose what they want to do with that particular money. So whenever there's government money to be had, and whenever that money is then being invested with certain guarantee returns, it's actually a clever idea. So much so that even Dictator Dan down here in Victoria, Bryce, has said, he says he's open-minded by this particular idea. Because one of the things that people need to understand, that if property prices stagnate or were to slow down or slow completely, the actual wealth creation effect and the economic effect of that is material. So if you want society to continue to keep growing, and if you want wealth per capita to keep growing, you need value creation to occur. And the best way it occurs for families is in their family home and also their superannuation. So, this is another means by which the Liberal government in New South Wales is putting that story together. Now, obviously, for those who are Labor-minded, I want to mention a couple of their policies because I think it's important that we get the balance right. So what Chris Minns is looking at, he's going to abolish this stamp duty idea, and what he's going to do is just ramp up the amount that you get for the first homeowners grant, where you don't pay stamp duty on your first property, to a purchase price of around $850 from memory. So it's actually around the same sort of cost, but it ultimately means that property prices will go up because it creates more demand in terms of that particular story. So I think it's a silly idea in terms of, because we want to get rid of stamp duty medium to longer term, right? It's not sustainable for the way in which we want to run our country. They want to appoint a rental commissioner, Bryce. Now, that's talking to the Greens base and the left base of the Labor Party. I think it's a dumb idea when 95% of most rental relationships are going okay, but I can understand they're talking to their base in that particular thing. They want to ban secret rental bidding. Guess what? It's already been done. You can't secret rental bid. You've got to set a price. It's really a transparent process, so that's nothing. They want to allow pets in rental properties, so they're potentially catching up with what's happening around the country. And one good idea, Bryce, introducing portable bond schemes. So this is actually sensible. So if renters are moving from home to home, it means that accessibility to their bond is a little bit quicker. It still doesn't release the ability for the landlord to claim for cost of repairs and maintenance that may have been caused by the tenant, but that just gives you some idea. So one good policy in that mix in terms of what that looks like. So, obviously it's a big choice in New South Wales in terms of, what's going to happen with the economic profile of that state and obviously with the property profile of that state. So it's a big decision for the people of New South Wales.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch how that transpires. So good luck for those people that are involved who listen to us in New South Wales and deciding on who you need to vote for in the upcoming election.
And the other big news, Bryce, we can't let this pass. But it's again very clear that the Palaszczuk government in Queensland is under political pressure in regards to the rental crisis they've got in that state. And like any...
Oh, good. So they've decided to release supply. Is that their response to it, Ben?
No, Bryce. What they've decided to do is potentially...
Tighten supply.
Tighten supply by introducing a rental cap, which will dampen demand for future investment in that particular location. It hasn't worked...
Knock me over with a feather.
Anywhere in the world, Bryce. But you know what, Bryce? It sounds good politically, right? If I'm talking to my base and there's, renting is tough, then am I going to get that vote of that person? Because what I did is, because obviously supply takes too long, I'm looking at elections and getting re-elected. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to placate. Thank you.
Right.
Those people by just saying, here's what I've done about it. I've put a rental freeze, which they're calling a rental cap, but let's be honest, it's a rental freeze.
Call it what it is. Yeah.
Let's call it what it is. So if they go down this path, you only need to research Ireland. I've said it before, it's the stupidest thing we've ever seen. It's meant that rents have actually, so when you put a cap on it, and if the cap's 10%, guess what? Everyone goes to 10%, then another 10%, then another 10%, because there's been no investment in the property market because you can't trust the government because they're interfering in the open market. And so rather than doing things that are going to be medium to longer term, which is the supply side, this is their Band-Aid fix, and it's classic of any politics. And I'll say it on both sides. It's not just the Labor. It happens more often with Labor, but it's on both sides in terms of it's the political...
Don't take advice from people who know the unintended consequences of the decisions that they make in the property market.
But the sad bit is, Bryce, we wouldn't care about it if it wasn't so important. I mean, these big decisions, these politicians run our states and they run the economic welfare of the state. And ultimately, if you don't have economic growth and economic prosperity, everyone suffers, right? There's less jobs to go around. So even not only do you not have people available to pay rent, there's people who are on unemployment benefits, and those people then have to go into social housing because they can't find affordable housing because they haven't got a job. It's very clear that your economic flywheel needs to have the least amount of regulation as possible to be able to continue to function and have that investment does create the jobs. And so it's a classic case of political pressure coming in from the Green side, from the left side of the Labor Party. If the right side of the Labor Party, the centralist party, which we've got in federal government, and you can see some of the value of that, if they were able to not listen to the left side of the party, this country would be better off, and the state economic outcomes in those particular states would also be far better than they currently are. I mean, if you think about the natural assets that Queensland has in terms of its beaches, in terms of its lifestyle, in terms of what it offers, that state has been underperforming for the last 30 years based on its, the economic principles of the leadership in that particular state. So I'm absolutely on my soapbox now.
Well, it's important, right? It's stupidity. It is just utter stupidity. So let's hope that that doesn't get up. So let's hope that common sense prevails. But what we do know about common sense and politicians and housing policies is never the twain shall meet. So, mate, big show. We've covered a fair bit. 4 great scenarios. Thanks again to the team for sharing those. We will do that a bit more in the future, mate. But until next week.
Knowledge is empowering, Bryce, but only if you act on it. Because as you said earlier, your future self will thank you for it.
I did say it earlier, mate. Well done. See you next week, folks.